And welcome back to ThinkTech. I'm Jay Fidell. This is Keeping the World Company, America keeping the world company, us keeping the world company. Today we're going to talk about international implications of America's shootout, the OK Corral. Welcome, Tim Apicella. Welcome, Stephanie Dalton. I want to bring out a commentary that was recently posted on ThinkTech.
Down the road on guns. Back in the day when Trump was president, we had these remarkable pitched battle street scenes in Seattle and Portland. There were armed law enforcement actors in unmarked uniforms attacking civilians. They were never held accountable. It was reminiscent of the brown shirts. With the expansion of guns and the right-wing base in this country, one wonders whether these events will repeat and expand into a daily cross-country Christmas tree of shootings, where more and more unhinged people have more and more guns and are shooting more and more victims in more and more places everywhere. The common denominator is that these shootings are always initiated by people armed with more and more powerful weapons against ordinary people who are unarmed, defenseless, and completely vulnerable. Like, for example, children in a school. How can we stop these mass murder assassinations? How can we come back from this nightmare, where murderers are well-equipped and free to kill whoever they want, where Congress does nothing, where the Supreme Court makes it worse, and where state legislatures simultaneously expand gun rights and guns? It's madness. We seem oblivious to the deadly terrorism across town, or maybe across the street, and the fact that the world looks at us and wonders whether we've lost our minds to let this happen. At the same time, there are those in other countries who have started to copycat our madness with their own mass shootings. This increasing gun violence and bloodshed, combined with the government's monumental failure to do anything about it, has had an undeniable and dreadful effect on our national psyche, and thus our nation. No surprise that people who worry about sending their kids to school have become depressed. These phenomena, taken together, are not only irrational, they reflect and also cause a loss of confidence in ourselves, our neighbors, and our country. We have never been faced with this level of threat before, where random violence shadows us every day and defines the quality of our lives and community and our national state of mind. When exactly will we come together to recognize how dangerous this is, not only for those among us who might become tragic targets, but for all of us who are affected by the resulting collective sense of insecurity and fear? This state of affairs is untenable and inconsistent with the continuation of our democracy.
That was a commentary that is useful for discussion. What are your thoughts, Tim?
We are a nation of frustration. We are a nation that does not know how to deal with the stresses of everyday life. And we are a nation where now it's acceptable to have an uncivil response to somebody. We have a nation where people can take action in the streets with violence. And we have a frustration with mental illness that has way too much access to military weaponry. And so where do we go from here? That is the question. And it's not a matter of just guns. It's a matter of mental health and our society to work with those that have mental health illness issues, and certainly those that don't have mental health issues but are just stressed out and have those moments of crisis. And we have to learn how to deal with that society, and we're doing a rather poor job of it.
Let's see that picture of the mass shootings in America, 2009 to current date. Stephanie, what's your reaction? How would you follow Tim's comments?
Well, my reaction is there's a glaring, gargantuan omission in an unending discussion about mental issues, mental health. The big glaring omission is, when are the girls going to kick in? There are no discussions of the women. My fear is that the girls ultimately will kick in eventually, and maybe to your point here in the show, that might happen other than in America, because we're way low on, in fact, must be insignificant, one of those 0.001 things, but there were some girls at the Capitol and like that. But no, really, this is a serious concern. So could we please get our thinking caps on and go with what we already know? And now let's find out a little bit more. Why is this all male?
the point of our discussion today is America the city on the hill, America the global leader in the economy and in morality up till now, I guess. Maybe it ended during the Trump years. In any event, what we have is a copycat phenomenon in Europe now, and this was revealed and detailed in an article in the Irish Times, which I have noticed sometimes has really extraordinary articles. And what it found was that people seem to copy the American culture point of violence and guns, and we have the beginning, at least the beginning, of shootouts, of mass murders in Europe. And the most stark example is only last week, when there were not one but two in the space of 2 days in Serbia and various places in Serbia, two different places in Serbia, where people killed a number of others. I'm not sure what kind of weapons they used. I don't think it was the AR-15 because that's not available in
the
Europe.
Kalashnikov is the weapon of choice.
Yes, and there are plenty of them. Plenty of Kalashnikov rifles bouncing around Europe because of the war in Bosnia years ago, and because Russia has an enormous number of shootouts in Russia. It's one of the high shootout numbers in all of Europe. So yes, it's Kalashnikovs. But can you talk about what happened, what it means?
Whether it be Serbia or in France with an individual behind a van that plows into a crowd of people, these are acts of terrorism. And many of these acts of terrorism in Europe has the same problem as we do in the United States, and that is we have a rash of mental illness that's not being dealt with. Acts of violence are being perpetrated against members of society and without any second thoughts to it. And we seem to be numb, and Europe seems to be also numb and ineffectual as far as trying to stem the tide of violence. It's a wave. Now, is that, I don't have any data on it, but to what degree does social media play on growing violence in Europe and the United States? To what degree does television violence influence, young minds, old minds, to take out their frustrations and stress out on the streets with an AR-15? These are correlations I can't make, but we know that we've discussed it for decades on violence and the portrayal of violence and how it does influence the minds of human beings. And it's coming to a crescendo. And I hate to say it, but I think COVID the last 3 years has helped that along. Well, isolationism has helped people not checking in with their fellow humans and sounding boards to find out, am I thinking wrongly? Am I thinking extremely without being able to bounce off their thoughts off of other human beings because COVID kept us separated?
Why would Europe be interested in copying us, Stephanie? What is it about the world today that creates this copycat phenomenon in Europe?
Well, we've recognized the status that America has had since World War II, and certainly before that. I mean, they look to this nation to see what the trends are and what it is we're doing. And now we're not doing everything good according to our value system. So I think that it has to do with that habit. I believe that they see these trends coming out of America as things that they are used to emulating and imitating, and it's going to include this issue too. Yeah, and then plus we have the internet involved in this too, so that's changing hearts and minds that may have not paid attention to this previously.
You mean the internet? What Tim was talking about, social media, ubiquitousness of telephones everywhere, smartphones everywhere, every kid on the street standing there communicating on the smartphone all day long and getting all those messages, including messages of American culture.
Well, yes, and also remember now we've been to war a lot over the last couple decades, so we've invaded all of these other countries, or we've come to their rescue, or what have you, and so the American is present now as a soldier with a gun. So what is the image that is in people's minds when they think American? I mean, what they've physically seen for the most part, more than tourists probably, are all of America's military forces that are in many, many countries, and also, working with allies. I mean, all of these it's not invasions, but where we've gone to war, there it's all in combination with other countries. We've gone in as a coalition.
We also find there's a right wing, don't we? And it's it's neo-Nazi. Tim, it's growing. It's a reaction to the migrants coming from the Middle East and Central Asia into Europe, and people don't like to have them around. They figure that they're going to take their jobs and undermine their society. And so you have people who wear swastikas, and some of the people, including in Serbia, who have been involved in these mass murders, are sporting, the Nazi insignia. And so it's got to be related to that too. And I guess I wonder if the Nazi resurgence, if you will, which is linked to, in many ways, to the migrant phenomenon, is also linked to the American right-wing phenomenon. And that gives it kind of an echo chamber between, the Nazi influence and the American. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. There's a correlation. In that article you sent, it was in Ireland. There was a reference that young men do, strange things when they feel isolated and outside the society's boundaries, be it through a lack of education or unemployment, or they can't get a girlfriend. This is very true in the Middle East. These three factors make them quite ripe for an organization to recruit them to either be a terrorist bomber or some kind of or here in the United States, certainly a white supremacy, extreme right wing organization. So you tend to pick on those who are on the fringes of society because they're not being incorporated in society for whatever reason, and they're ripe for this kind of recruitment.
But what I hear from you is the notion that these unhinged people who go out and get guns and then shoot strangers or people they know, whatever, mass murder killings, are motivated, at least in part, by some kind of political ideology, like right-wing ideology, or in Europe, Nazi ideology.
Well, yeah. And remember what's the basis of that ideology. It always boils down, and Donald Trump certainly was a master at tapping into this, is your sense of grievance, your sense of unresolved grievances that have not been resolved by the government or by institutions and will not be resolved. And therefore, you give up and you say, I'm going to the other extreme. I'm going to act out because I have grievance. And we have a lot of it in this country, and I think Europe does too.
Do you find a parallel, at least from the sources that are written up in the Irish Times article, a parallel in the sense that people are, they feel they have grievances and they feel the government's not doing right by them. And so they're, generally disconnected and disenchanted. So they're more likely to do this sort of thing. And looking over the pond, looking at what goes on in the U.S., looking at that map of all these shootouts and the American culture and the OK Corral, those things somehow combine to give them license to do what happens here. And those, I was going to ask you if there's a distinction between terrorism and individual shootouts. It seems to me that it's more like a continuum. It's nuanced. It's a gray area. There's a little of both in both.
It is twofold. And number one is leadership. Donald Trump gave permission for people in this country to act out badly, either through their thoughts and words or their behavior and actions. But it was that green flag of permission to say nothing is too outrageous when you feel a sense of grievance.
Stephanie, there are factors in Europe that make Europe different, and it's also covered in the article in the Irish Times. One is it costs a lot of money to buy a gun in Europe, and they're not so easily available, except in the black market kind of situation. I mean, for example, an AR-15 costs $5,000 in euros, while a Kalashnikov costs only I don't know, $1,000 or something like that. Not that much. And so what you have is a difficulty in executing, the assassination of people. And so you also don't have as many of these mass murders in Europe as you do here. And I'm not sure why, except they don't have a history of that. And some countries don't allow guns. For example, in Serbia, right after these two events last week, the president of Serbia said, "I'm taking all the guns. Will be no more guns in Serbia." And apparently in Serbia, he feels he can do that. Lots of luck in the U.S. But there are factors in Europe that change the calculus. And that although we see indications as reflected in all the sources that the Irish Times reports, there are also factors that limit the amount of guns and the amount of gun violence. How does that play into the future?
It's so ironic that we're talking about this article out of the Irish Times. Okay. I mean, we have nothing to teach those people about this terrorism and domestic violence and getting guns and shooting everybody up and trying to kill the queen while she was visiting at the hotel. I mean, and Germany too. They went with decades of this kind of the Green Group. I can't recall all of the political issues they had, but these have been fierce, robust terrorism cells in Europe.
Although not every mass murderer can speak to, terrorist ideology, it's the terrorism that gives license. Tim, we've had not one but two attempts on public officials in Japan, and I don't recall that ever happening before. And so this sense of license that people in various places around the world seem to take from the U.S., from that map of all these incidents, it's not just Europe. It's other places like Asia. Yeah. And I fear that you could even say the violence we see in Myanmar with the Rohingya is also somehow a function of the license that people get from looking at the U.S. Because they say, well, violence is okay in the U.S. Guns are good. We can do that too. Do you think there's any merit to that?
There's some merit in that. It's so hard to draw correlations and be able to prove those correlations. But, I remember backpacking in Africa, in the 90s, and the two things that would come out of people's mouth is America, Bill Clinton, Rambo, in the same sentence, in the same breath, Rambo and Bill Clinton. So, we do export violence. Our movies, the movie capital of the world of Hollywood, exports violence and bad stereotypes too, by the way. But so there is definitely. But I think more than Hollywood, I keep going back to TikTok. And if you ever watch TikTok, some of the horrible things you see of other people doing to other people as comedy. I mean, this isn't slapstick comedy. This is slap in the face, real pain, real violence to people. And somehow it's being perceived and it's being portrayed as humor, comedy. And so it's TikTok, it's social media where horrible behavior is being portrayed as if it's humorous and funny. Americans' Top Videos, I forget what channel it was on, but they would have people falling off of bikes and real damage to themselves. And people thought that was funny. And I couldn't look at it. I couldn't watch it because I don't think it's funny when people do bad things to other people.
Schadenfreude, enjoying the misfortune of others. The interesting question is that not everybody in Europe is on the same page over this. And I'm reminded of another article that was in the Irish Times a year or two ago, where the writer said, "How should we feel about America under Trump?" And he answered it with a long argument to the point that we should feel pity for America. Mm-hmm. And that went viral around the world. Pity. That's how a lot of Europeans feel. In the article I sent you, the current article, there was a discussion of how many Europeans are really very confused about what America is doing. How could America allow all these shootings and take no action, not on the day after the shooting or any time thereafter, and allow it to continue? They are confused about why this country, the beacon on the hill, the moral leader and all that, could ever allow this to happen. And I suppose we here are likewise confused. But what? Where does this go? It seems to me it's kind of two factors are working in Europe. One factor is, we're disenchanted with government. We're going to follow, the Trump crowd and the OK Corral crowd in the U.S. And the other is, what is wrong with those people? We can't figure it out. Mm-hmm. Which one do you think will prevail going forward?
We have people still on the planet and kicking from Sinn Féin. I mean, these people that have done this in Europe, in European countries, are there. They did it, they resolved it, and they're walking around now. So hopefully there are people that are studying. I mean, it seems like maybe too weak in a put, but still we need to know what was driving all of that terrorism and warfare in those countries. But they resolved it. And it's
well, in large part they did. But just when you thought it was safe to go outside again, you have 7 or 8 people being killed by a 13-year-old. I mean, that sounds so familiar. It could happen anywhere in the U.S. right now today. It may be happening as we speak. There's a little Americana there in Serbia. And I guess the question I put to you is, are we going to see more of that? What do you think?
Well, Jay, do you think that, I'm hearing more statements about the Second Amendment and it's and that it's due for a reinterpretation. So I'm hearing that on the shows, on the major shows. So I'm sure there's going to be pushback for that, but at some point we are going to have to revisit all of that and have to do something, because until we do something about all of the guns, how do we make sense of any of it? I mean, if we go to the Sinn Féin people and the people in Germany that were having their terrorism, I think they had clear agendas, pretty clear agendas. We have some here, the Proud Boys, these people, their agendas there. Then you get into the Trump thing and it's got all smeared, all this stuff all over, where there's no honor, the honor among thieves. I mean, there isn't even any little figment of any value.
Tim, one difference between the U.S. and Europe, for example, I could not speak for Asia. There's probably many brands in Asia, is that we have the Second Amendment, and they don't. Mm-hmm. And although there are, different numbers from different countries, for example, I remember that France has an inordinate number of mass killings, and maybe that's because they've had some really big ones. Seems to me that if you just do a logic thing on this and you say, well, the place that does have a Second Amendment has more shootings. The place that doesn't have a Second Amendment and allows government to stop guns, it does better. It would seem to me that, just as Stephanie says, it's time, really, in a logical sense. I don't think it will happen practically, but it's time to can the Second Amendment. No?
Because that they say, I've read that this is not the interpretation.
I got a better idea. Go ahead, Stephanie.
No, I'm just saying that the interpretation, the nuance, the implications of the Second Amendment that we abide by now, that are regulations and law, were not the ones that were there from the beginning of the Constitution. So I think there's a case to be made for making that happen. On the other hand, we could look back at Japan when the samurai Bushido code was in place, and you know what? Everybody had a sword back there, did whatever they wanted with it. I mean, there's all kinds of examples and models to go to see how what are these patterns? Is it mental illness? What is it? Is it testosterone? Let's get what we need, more information.
The Irish Times thinks it might be testosterone. He talked about macho-ness.
Stephanie, I always respect and admire your opinions, but I think we don't need any more studies on this problem. We have paralysis through analysis. And I think rather than try to bury the Second Amendment, how about we look at the collateral damage from the Citizens United Supreme Court decision? The amount of money that goes into Congress basically buys off politicians so that they don't act and won't act because the NRA says, I'm going to scorecard you and you better be on the right side of my point system. There's the problem, is dark money in the political system that makes politicians quiver and quake in their boots because they don't want to be on the wrong side of the NRA or any other political action campaign group, be it through immigration or anything else, because they've been bought and paid for, they've been bribed, legally bribed, and there is, in my opinion, the source of our problems and our demise.
Yeah, well, you're right. It's more systemic than just the Second Amendment. It's the people who preserve the Second Amendment, who give millions to preserve the Second Amendment, which, they don't have that in Europe. They don't have that in many places in the world. And it's just one of the comments about somebody in Europe was that they say in America that if you have the Second Amendment, it will preserve freedom. Is that freedom? I suggest that without guns, we have a better kind of freedom here. So, all of the logic that goes around the Second Amendment and guns just in this country, it's all twisted. And we have forgotten how to think straight on this subject. And really, I'm hoping that Europe will remember how to think straight on the subject. And maybe Serbia will cut out all the guns, and other countries will see this, and they will see the role models in other countries. It's a strange thing in human nature. Human nature is always looking for a role model. Societies are looking for role models. Countries are looking for role models. If they see, for example, a terrorist act in one place in Europe, it's licensed to do violence, whether the violence is another terrorist act or it's, some 13-year-old shooting up his class. Either way. So once you set up a role model, you're asking for trouble. I mean, you want to set up positive role models. And I suggest that's what we're looking at here in both places. Unfortunately, the U.S. has gone over the side in terms of role models, and Trump has unloosed really negative role models. And then we, in turn, as a country, we become a role model for others. So it acts in a viral way. Thoughts about that, Tim? Do you agree?
I do. And, when we talk about the loss of freedom, we always say, well, to maintain our freedom, we need to be able to protect ourselves. And you're trying to guard against some kind of kinetic force, right? But democracy isn't lost to an invasion per se from Russia or from China. Our democracy, our freedoms will be undermined by would-be fascists like Donald Trump that undermine our institutions that have the mission of maintaining democracy. That's how we lose our freedom, by allowing leaders like Donald Trump and his lackeys to undermine our institutions. That should be looked at much, much faster and sooner than the Second Amendment and a right to preserve and keep weapons.
Stephanie, I'm reminded of a mass murder in eastern Canada a couple of years ago, where a number of people were killed in some kind of crazy shootout. And then, it brings the notion that people all over the world watch American, as Tim says, they watch American TV, they engage in American social media, they copycat our movies and the violence and vengeance in our movies. All of this is a global phenomenon. We have to remember that what we do, we are on the world stage. What we do is a role model for really everywhere in different degrees. And we can see that happening now. I think that's what happened in Serbia. Stephanie, are we doing anything about being a role model, about extending our culture to a global audience?
Well, I hope that we always have, through codes and the way that media has and movies and all that have been regulated in the past, which of course they are not now. But everybody has to have their coliseum, right? We're human. So we have to have the Coliseum. So we've got that going out now. It's just enormous packages through movies, etc. But it's at what point is there enough of that to solve that whatever that human piece of it that needs to be tended to? Then when does it go beyond that and become the corrupt force that it can be that gets in the way of freedom?
Yeah.
Because you got this power thing. And what's the easiest way to power in today's world is to get the gun. I mean, I can be the most powerful person in Hawaii if I'm walking around with my AR, or how about my tank that I'm going to get? I mean, everybody's going to
the remarkable thing, and I don't remember where I saw this, is that although we have 400 million guns in this country, 125% of our population, the number of people that own those guns is a very small percentage. They're the only ones that are armed. This is a real problem. You and I have talked about Trump for all these years of his administration, and we said this guy is going to bring the country down. This guy is going to allow for all kinds of, breakage in our democracy, in our society, in our social connection. He's going to divide us. He's going to have dark forces conquer us. And one thing I did not anticipate when we had those conversations was that what was happening, which I think correctly identified, what was happening is we were doing this on the world stage, and it would have an effect everywhere. You can think isolationist, but the fact is that everybody watches, everybody sees, and until this point, everybody copies. So this goes to the question of whether they will continue to copy us and say, the U.S. ain't showing me anything. They're confused. They don't know where they're going. They can't solve their problems. They have gun violence. They have social problems 10 yards, 10 feet high. We're going to find another way. And indeed, the BRICS countries are trying to find another reserve currency. They're trying to get away from us. And so my question to you is, when these other countries realize that the influence we are providing, like it or not, and historically, culturally, is a bad influence, what's going to happen? Do you have a thought about that?
That's a tough question, Jay, because where do they turn? They could look inward and they have their own issues, as the United States does. Every country has their problems. We just happen to be a very strong nation economically and militarily, and that, for whatever reason, provides influence. And is it well placed? I don't know. We used to be the shining city, but remember, we had slavery, so we're not perfect. We committed genocide against Native Americans, so our influence is not as shiny as we think it is. But if we're gonna export our influence, let's export things that we can get done to stop this mass murdering in our streets of and cities in the United States that we are now seemingly to export to Europe. And that is, the simple stuff like red flag laws, criminal background checks, mental illness background checks, limits on ammo magazines, limit on AR-15s. Let's be an example of something we can get done and do something about the problem that faces us each and every day with mass shootings each and every day. But are we doing it? No. Why? Because money rules the politicians, and money comes from agencies, thanks to the Supreme Court decision of Citizens v. United.
I'll take that as your closing comments.
That was my closing.
I think it was very worthy. Stephanie, you have 1 minute to close.
Yes. I want to say what I meant to bring in earlier is that these international relations are starting to droop, because already there are numerous countries that have got travel warnings up for America. They don't want their citizens going to the U.S. because it is so dangerous. And you don't know when you're going to get your head shut off without even seeing who's doing it. So there is a really important marker, because that has to do with the money. The good points that Tim just raised, because we could really make our tourism going away in other conditions if people stop coming, and then we're going to lose our dignity, and it's just going to go downhill from there.
International implications of America's shootout. And this is something to follow, because right now we only have a certain amount of data on it. I seriously fear that we'll see more data, and it won't be pretty. Yeah. Thank you so much, Tim, Stephanie. Aloha.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.